We are very lucky to have Annie Egan join us tonight. Annie Egan is the founder of Worth Wellness. She has worked with teens in school and home settings for over 20 years and is a frequent presenter for schools and community agencies across the country. In fact, she's been with us before, in case you recognize her. Um, Rooted in a deep foundational knowledge of adolescent development and with a lens of compassion, her work focuses on creating effective systems, enhancing communication, and strengthening relationships. Annie received her bachelor's from Duke University and her master's in counseling psychology from University of San Francisco. Welcome, Annie. I also will just be introducing our youth speaker. We are so excited to have Cole Green join us. Cole is a junior at Terra Linda High School. He's a volunteer with OD Free Marin and serves on the Marin County Youth Commission, as well as his school's Student Wellness Advisory Committee. So with that, I will hand it on over to our speakers.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the warm welcome and the warm return welcome. And I love hearing all of these housekeeping items around these presentations because it feels like it's a slide of my work. That it's a foundational component of what you do. The concept of self compassion and without judgment and being here to learn. It's just so nice that that goes in kind of the boilerplate intro as opposed to a slide on my deck. So I feel very lucky to be here in a space that is so just authentically purely what I believe. So thank you for allowing me here again. And I do want to just give another welcome to Cole. Um, most people here have a teenager, and I bet most of them are not sitting on a Zoom with with a couple hundred parents ready to be peppering with information and questions. So I just really am very grateful for his voice and his insight and his willingness to be here. So thank you. Okay, I am going to share my screen. Okay, parenting to support our teens. So I am going to be talking a bit about the parenting styles. And I'm not sure, I think I may have only learned about this in graduate school, as opposed to when I was becoming a parent. I don't think I worked in high schools for a long time. I don't think this was something that came up a ton. But when I was kind of researching this for this presentation, it just feels so relevant, and something that should be quite accessible versus something that's in, a psychology textbook. So this is going to be a bit of content. I will add some anecdotes to them, so it feels a little more real. But again, the introductions that were provided before mine about that idea of looking at these ideas without judgment and with invitation to self-reflect versus self-shame is really important, because I would imagine there'll be nuggets of all of these things that everyone in the room has done. So we're always just kind of optimizing, so that we have an idea of what we're looking for. Respond to your children with love in their worst moments, their broken moments, their angry moments, their selfish moments, their lonely moments, their frustrated moments, their inconvenient moments, because it is in their most unlovable human moments that they most need to feel loved. And I think that that is kind of encapsulate a lot of, in my experience and when I work with families, the hardest piece is when that toddler who is having the meltdown and you're looking at their sadness and you can comfort them becomes a teenager whose meltdown looks very different, right? And they might be very angry and they might be saying unkind things and they might be really acting out in ways that are quite unsavory. And it is so hard to remember that that is that same version, right? That toddler is now in adolescence and going through that same expansive growth and tension. and need to feel loved, even when they are doing everything that they possibly can to kind of signify something different, right? That there's often that push, um, that's quite, it's not nuanced. It's often quite literal. Get away from me. But they really do, in those absolutely human moments, is when they need our love and steadiness the most. So these parenting styles, in 1967, a child psychologist named Diana Baumrind identified three parenting styles: authoritative, authoritarian, and permissive. And then a few years later, she added a fourth called negligent. Sometimes it's called uninvolved, sometimes it's called neglectful. It kind of depends on how clinical people are talking. There is also a way of looking at it that determines whether the level of demandingness and the level of responsiveness. Sometimes they talk about the level of connection. So generally, authoritarian and authoritative are higher in demand, and authoritative and permissive is higher in responsiveness or connection. So I'm going to go through these four styles and talk about what they are, kind of their pros and cons, and what this might look like, especially as we're thinking of, establishing boundaries and consequences and expectations around safety, and rules. If I had to classify our parenting style, I would call it a 24/7 terrifying, all-consuming, worrying style, which might be the case for many people in this room, especially if they're joining for maybe the first time and their students are now in a different social sphere, or they're engaged in different things than they ever had to. I was thinking I have two slides, or two nuggets, I guess, that are repeats from last year that I didn't have in here originally, because I don't really like to repeat. But I realized that there might be quite a number of people who, if they were here last year, something might not have felt relevant, right? They might have had a kid that was engaged in really different things than they're engaged in now. I used to give a parenting talk at a school where I worked. It was the same exact parenting talk every year, with intention, because people would come back and learn what was relevant to them then. That they would know, wait a second, there's that thing. I don't remember it because I wasn't listening, because my kid was not engaged in that at all then. But now, my goodness, I need all of those tips. So there is going to be a couple nuggets of repeat in case they might be relevant now, or it's just nice to repeat. Authoritarian. This is about 25% of parents. This is the because I said so. They are normally less nurturing, have high expectations, limited flexibility. It's usually a one-way communication. So the parent says how it is and the kid does it. No negotiation. The rules are often not explained. Again, that because I said so piece. And the children are expected to uphold without error. And if there are errors, it usually would lead to punishment. So the pros is these kids usually are the most well behaved in the room. They are very clear on the consequences. They are able to adhere to clear instructions and multi steps required to reach a goal. They're quite functional, right? And I think what is also most challenging, I think, as a parent who might inhabit this zone, is that it is very effective, right? So if you're looking around the room and you're looking at all these other parents of doing these other styles and their kids are misstepping all over the place, and you're like, oh, look at me, huh? Like, mine's never done that. I've never had this problem, right? Like, my kid does exactly what I want them to do. I don't know why everyone's talking about this. Why is everyone making this so hard? The cons are very important. And it's also hard because they are not immediately seen, right? These are things that often surface, not later in life, like generationally, but it could happen when they leave the home. It could happen when they're in college. It could happen when they're looking for their partner as their or as their parenting, right? So they have these kind of residual impacts that are easy to turn a blind eye to if you're looking to do that. So some of those cons, It can result in children who have higher levels of aggression. These levels of aggression are often hard to manage because they aren't given a lot of guidance or examples of how to manage it, right? Because there really isn't much friction. It's there. No one's fighting back. No one's saying that's not fair, because it's kind of my way or the highway. So they are not used to being able to get upset about something and learn how to regulate, right? To have that exposure to that caring adult who is modeling to them and tolerating and nurturing and comforting and consoling a kid who is very, very dysregulated, right? More often than not, it is, quit it, right? There's no crying in baseball. There's no, stop your nonsense. This is ridiculous, right? There is not a lot of attention on the dissatisfaction. So when they reach the world and they might be dissatisfied and they're allowed to be, they don't have a lot of practice regulating. They don't have a lot of practice coming down because they've never had it, right? They've just been kind of, yes, okay, fine. And everything just kind of is shoved down in there. They might also be shy, right? If you're thinking about if you were living in existence where things are just, you're not supposed to talk a lot, you're not supposed to have the feedback, you're not supposed to engage. You often are kind of just compromising your personality, right? You just kind of go in. So sometimes that might look like they're shy, or they might have a hard time interacting socially. They will certainly be very polite, right? These are the kids who, are definitely not the ones who are saying, I don't feel comfortable with hugging Aunt Sally, right? And can I do a handshake instead? They are hugging Aunt Sally, right? So if you think about all of the research and literature that is coming out around, your body and consent and all of those generational things that we're looking to disrupt, this is an example of where there would not be room for disruption for that kid, right? They need to do it. They're expected. It also makes it harder for them to make their own decisions because again, they have no practice doing that, right? Their decision is I am going to comply. That's it. That is the only one available to them. It is always a decision, right? They do have a choice. It's just that the alternative is highly unappealing. So it doesn't make it a very viable choice for them to play off. It just feels like I need to do what I'm supposed to do. This also can result in lower self-esteem, and lower self-esteem and decision making very frequently go hand in hand. We'll see that in several of these slides. And if we're thinking about substance use and we're thinking about being in precarious situations where you need to dig deep into your value core, into your integrity, if you do not have self esteem that says, I am worth taking care of myself, I am worth doing the hard thing, I am worth doing something different than my peers, I am worth doing something that might alienate me because I'm strong enough to be out on my own, right? If you don't have that, it is so hard to do those things, right? To make that choice that might make you have a feeling of I'm out here on an island, because you're not quite sure if that is if you're worth it, right? You're not really told that very often. What you're told is that you need to do as you say. It's right, so that it doesn't build that level of kind of self advocacy or self sufficiency. It's just you're a little responsive to someone else. So it often can also, as they're, in a big way, can also influence the child to rebel. As they grow older, they might just get really sick of this and just kind of pop. So this is a very common, obviously, 25% of parents, and that figure was from this year, so it's not antiquated. It's a hard one to break again because it is so effective in that short term. So those cons are just something to kind of to mull over, and hopefully when we get to the next slide, it might actually, to kind of see them back to back, it makes it a little easier to see the contrast too.
I'd love to jump in here, Annie, if,
Sure.
if
Thanks.
that's okay. Yeah, just personal experience. I know as a teenager and just as a youth, growing up and seeing my friends a lot of examples come to mind when you talk about people who have that style of parenting and who have lived with that. And I think what you said was extremely accurate. And your last point, especially about like the values that you need to build as a teen, I think when you're almost given that parenting style or you're parenting your kid in that way, they aren't you're not allowing them to build these certain values that they need to carry with them for their life. By just telling them exactly what to do, they're not able to experiment with different values and be able to, see if what works for them in this way or if it works for them better in this way. And I think not being able to fall and then get back up and learn and just doing exactly what you're told often leads to exactly what you pointed out in the cons. And then I have a friend, particularly who I unfortunately feel like is parented in this way. And to be honest, like going into college in the next few years, I feel like I don't know exactly what you mentioned. Once he's out of his house and his parents aren't going to be on him managing his expectations, I think anything could happen. You don't really know, but he's been top of his class. He's been doing well in the classroom. Great kid, talented. But once he leaves for college, he won't have his parents there to tell him to do this or to do that every single time. And therefore, it could lead to almost anything. But I think what you mentioned in values is so extremely important as someone who's not able to build what they want to build in their life.
Thank you. So authoritative, and hopefully, Cole, we have some friends with this crew too. So this is, I'm going to round up just for optimism. This is about 50% of parents. Okay, so in general, this is the parenting style that leads to the healthiest outcomes for children. Okay, so I'm going to say it again. This is the one that leads to the healthiest outcomes for children. And this is the healthiest. This is not. These are not research studies that are talking about substance use. They're not research studies that are talking about screen addiction. They're not research studies that are focused on healthy eating habits. They are research studies that are focused on everything. Okay, so it is across the board. These are the healthiest people grow out of this style. Okay, and this will come up as a con as well, but again, it requires a lot of patience and effort for both parties. So the good news is that the audience that I often see at events like this are looking, right, that they are putting in the patience and they're putting in the effort and they are trying and they care. So everyone showing up here is already ahead of the curve. It's very frequently the people that don't even or interested at all in learning how to best meet their teen that I really just want to be in their house and giving them flyers. But maybe it can happen through peer support. Maybe it can happen through just you taking this dialogue and bringing it to a casual coffee with somebody if they're having a hard time with their teen. Just information I always feel is power, especially if it's relayed without judgment and with compassion. Again, just to echo and echo and echo. So the characteristics of this authoritative style: clear guidelines for expectations and reasons associated, right? This is the opposite of because I said so. They don't need to agree, right? They don't need to, you don't need full compliance with, because sometimes you will care about something that your kid does not. But there are reasons. It's not random. It's not a power trip. And that the disciplinary actions associated are explained. Okay, so it's again, there's not walking on eggshells of, oh my God, what am I going to do? Is he going to care about this? Are they not going to care about this? I have no idea what's going to happen if I misstep, right? That is a very stressful way for a teenager who is already stressed just because of their brain and their body and the world and everything around them to walk through their home. Okay. Disciplinary methods are used as a way of support, right? And learning, right? Discipline, that the purest form, is learning, it's teaching, right? So it's used as a way of support instead of punishment. There are natural consequences. Natural consequences are my favorite things in the world, right? These kids are law abiding, right? There's laws that you guys aren't making up, that the government's making up. There's schools that you guys aren't enforcing that the school can enforce, right? There's things beyond your home that can be your partners in this, right? So if they are late to school, there is a natural consequence of being late to school. The school is going to say something, theoretically, right? Or they might get a tardy. It might affect their grade. They might get a detention. They might, whatever that is, that's not on you, that's on them, right? The school has provided this natural consequence, right? They forget their notebook, there's a natural consequence. They don't have it, right? So those natural consequences are, if anytime you can find them, use them. Children have input into these goals and expectations. Okay, again, they don't need to full heartedly agree, but they need to be involved and they need to understand. So it's not arbitrary. Okay, and what they might understand is, it might be, I don't know that this feels scary to you, but it feels really scary to me. Okay, and this is why. This is what I learned, right? So, given these facts and figures, the idea of you being out with a new driver, and they might be using or they might be, distracted by their phone, it makes me nervous. I know that you're not nervous. I get that, right? But it makes me nervous. So, that is why, because of the information that I've learned, that we're going to put this thing in place that you are not to drive with people who have not had their license for X amount of time. Right. So again, the kid doesn't need to come with you raising their hand and saying, yes, I feel like it's really out of control and dangerous. But they do need to understand where you're coming from, if that makes sense. Frequent, appropriate levels of communication between the parent and the child, right? There are going to be boundaries. This is not boundary-less, that we have this nice conversation, we're coming together, they don't agree, we're going to come back. Well, let's just keep talking about it because we're supposed to be open and we can keep discussing. We can keep discussing. No, at some point, there is going to be, I know we don't agree, right? But this is my point, and I hope you were able to respect it. And if you aren't, this is what is going to happen, right? It's just that all of that legwork that happened before, right, is the juicy stuff, right? It's the why, it's the reasons, it's the expectations. Those are the things that need to happen so that you can say that. So you can say, I heard you, right? We've talked about this 4 times. I have heard you every time. And I think we need to just agree to disagree, right? That's different than authoritarian, right? You might feel authoritarian when you have that moment of like, we're done, right? But that's a boundary. Boundaries are awesome. Boundaries contain everybody. It's not thoughtless. So some pros of this, I mean, this, you can't argue with this. So these children grow up to be more confident, responsible, and able to self-regulate. Okay. So again, back to that emotional regulation, about anger management. Let's say that parent and child has had this conversation 4 times. Parent put the foot down, and that kid is losing it, right? They are so angry. And what they will learn is how to regulate, right? That in a way that if there was none of that friction, they would not have that exposure, right? So they are learning how to self regulate, accept a no, right? And move on and be able to comply. They can manage their negative emotions more effectively, which leads to better social outcomes and emotional health, right? Anyone who can manage their emotional business is generally easier to be with socially, right? It's a fun place to be when you can be in your body and not feel that kind of out of control and kind of desperate feeling that you feel sometimes when you are just looking to do anything other than be present, right? And that happens a lot with kids who are feeling unheard and unseen and unvalued. They just don't want to be in their skin. And that makes it really hard to be authentic, right? If you can manage your emotions and feel integrated and authentic, you are socially more appealing, right? It's easier to be with, it's easier to connect with, it's easier to give love to somebody else. It's a nicer way to go through the world. Children learn that they are capable of accomplishing goals on their own, okay, which leads to higher self-esteem. So Cole, like, as what you said, that kid who has had a parent tell them every step of the way how to do this, this, and this, right? And what thing to put forward, and what when you turn this in, and what this should look like. They might feel like, sweet, I'm the president, but they would not necessarily have a lot of confidence that if their parent had not provided that content to them, that they would be in the same place without them, right? And how good would it feel for a teenager to really have that confidence of like, I did this. Like I did this myself. Right. And the cool part was is that I like didn't make it a couple times. Right. And my parents just still loved me. Right. There was no like, I told you so. I told you this was going to take longer than you thought it would. And you never listened to me and you just wanted to do it on your own. And look what happened. Right. Like not helpful. It just feels alienating. It feels judgy. It feels like I'm insufficient. Right. As opposed to like, oh, bud, I'm bummed for you. Right. I know that you worked hard on that. Right. Is there anything you could, that you want to do differently next time? Or is there anything I can support you with? Is there anything I could help? Right. Like you are offering, it's not like you are just leaving it to them. But through that support, this kid now has the practice to do it themselves, right? And to still feel connected. They don't need to feel isolated, but they could still win that presidency, right? And like, oh my gosh, mom, I can never thank you enough for, helping me pass out those flyers, right? She didn't make them for them. She didn't even say that they needed to be done. She didn't even say where they should be hung up. But she may have, put a staple in a couple telephone poles. That's okay. Right. So it's just a really nice partnership when you are able to let your teen learn for their own selves and be able to celebrate that with them. And this is all, oh, people do care about this. I don't not care about education. But for those who care the most, children have a high level of academic achievement and school performance from this parenting style. Okay. So, and that was quite overwhelmingly true. So again, those other kids might be the quietest ones in the classroom and never a problem for those teachers, but these are the kids that have the highest level of academic achievement and school performance. This is what develops a close, nurturing relationship, right? So we're talking close with your parents, we're talking healthy outcomes, we're talking emotional regulation, good schooling, good friendships. Like this is a good setup here, right? It's a good setup for a kid to feel like, I think I know what I want. I'm given the freedom to be able to explore it, and I'm able to try some things on for size, see what works, see what doesn't, and there's going to be a nurturing, loving person holding me if I fall and celebrating with me if I win. The only con is that it requires that patience and effort on both parties. Because generally speaking, and really almost with intention, there will be misses, right? That something is going to go wrong, whatever that wrong looks like. And in my mind, it's not even wrong; it's just information, right? It's the misstep. It's the I had too many to drink and I need to get picked up, and I'm a hot mess and I need to call my parent, right? And with this parenting style, it allows for that, right? There is going to be a natural consequence of you not feeling well. There might be a natural consequence of a kid being really embarrassed. There might be a natural consequence of them getting in a fight or it being a school function and now they're in trouble. I mean, there are a gazillion natural consequences of that, right? And you are able to reflect back to them things that you had talked about, things that you had agreed upon, what the consequences are going to be. And everyone's on the same page. It doesn't come as a surprise. There isn't rage and judgment. You're just looking to continue to have those conversations while you're still in a nurturing relationship. So sometimes it feels like, how many of these conversations do I have to have? Right? I'm doing this parenting style. My kid is tripping up every weekend. I don't understand what's happening. Right? And that just means, and we'll get to this in a little bit later, that just means that the consequence needs to be adjusted. Right? That it obviously whatever's going on is not aversive enough for that kid to not change the behavior. So that is again on the parent, right? That's not on the kid. So the kid, when we find the right consequence or we find the right motivator and you have the connection, it will start to generate behaviors that match and align with the values of the family. Now we have permissive. Um, I think we see this quite a bit out here. The data says 20%. I feel like in my world, I see this a lot more than that. But this is that kind of, there's very few boundaries, there's rare use of discipline. They tend to be very warm parents and nurturing, just not a lot of expectations. So there's often, even if they have expectations, they frequently don't impose the rules because they want to avoid conflict. Communication is way open, which is great. And parents are allowing their children to figure things out for themselves. You know, that kind of idea of like, you're the boss, like you got this. Again, there's nothing overtly awful about some of, you know, of this style. And it often does lead to very close relationships. These kids often have, you know, it was delegated as average self-esteem and decent social skills. But the cons are, in my mind, are relevant, right? So this is that space of like, is this a friend or a parent, right? That you know, very frequently people have friends, you know, parents have friends, where they're thinking like, oh my gosh, like my kid doesn't share that stuff with me at all, right? Like, right. And then it might get to the point of like, why do they share that with you? Like, I'm not sure that I even want to know that. That sounds like something I would think that they would want to tell their friend, not their parent. Um, Frequently, this comes out of this parenting style, right? That those boundaries are not don't elicit that feeling of like, you know, I know my audience, right? Like I'm really close with my parents and my guardians, or you know, I know my grandmother's going to love me unconditionally, but like she really doesn't need to know about that. Um, and sometimes without that guidance on moderation, right? If it's just this like free flow and everything, it can lead to other negative habits, right? So there is, you know, they might binge, right? It might be about, you know, it might be about eating, it might be about substance use, it might be about screen time. There just isn't a lot of moderation going on. It's just kind of, you know, whatever you want to do. So those excessive freedoms, like if they don't have a bedtime or you're not on them about homework and it's just, you know, it's up to you, like it's your school, it's whatever you want to do. Or weekend fun, like I trust you. It can expose, they don't have that exposure, right? So it's the same thing about not having that exposure to emotional regulation. Permissive parents deny that exposure to moderation, just in terms of how much is too much. So these kids often can be impulsive or demanding, selfish, and they often do lack that self-regulation that we see so strongly with authoritative parents. So again, this isn't giant awful, but it's something, right? It's not ideal. And those boundaries are really, really helpful for kids and very containing. Neglectful and uninvolved. These kids, I think, are the most striking to me. And when I worked in schools, they were the ones that I always felt um, like I was put there to support because they were the most unassuming in terms of their need, right? That they were usually in my office because they were in trouble. Um, and after rapport and after years of connection, right, that time and time again, I would get from some kid, I just, I wish my parents ever asked me where I was going. Never. They never did. Right. I got a car. I got a car on my 16th birthday. They never even like taught me how to drive. Like I never have gotten in trouble ever. Like so and so gets in trouble like every weekend. Like, do you know what that means? That means that like her parents care so much about what she does that they're ready to like impose like consequences and have all of these annoying conversations. Like my parents are just not here. Like they're just not here. And I think that for a long time, if they are not given the space like a counseling office or a dear friend or someone that allows and opens and kind of invites that vulnerability. If you are one of these kids, you can very easily convince yourself that this is awesome, right? But when push comes to shove, it just feels good to be loved and for someone to go out of their way and be inconvenienced by you, right? That there is something about a parent being really inconvenienced that is a great show of love. And we don't need it all the time, right? I am not inviting parents to go be, running their kids' notebooks anywhere when they forget them and missing, but that feeling of like, yes, this is hard, right? This is hard. I imposed that consequence that said that you couldn't drive and now I need to drive you. Yep, this is hard. But I'm not giving up, right? Or yeah, I'm staying up. I am absolutely exhausted. But yes, I'm staying up because I said I would. Because I want to check your eyes when you walk in the store, right? It's inconvenient. And that sometimes is a language of love. So these characteristics, they're given a lot of freedom. Parents usually are out of the way. They fulfill the child's basic needs, but remain generally detached from the child's life. There is generally not a particular discipline style. There's not a lot of communication, and not very much nurturing, and very few or no expectations. Okay. So I think in like research studies, this might look like a different, the neglectful might feel like, wow, that is so not anyone I know, right? Like my kid has, there's new clothes and they're tended to and there's everything. But I think that there's a whole lot of other ways of thinking about this, that have more to do with that just kind of lack of presence and care. So the pros are, again, they are usually quite resilient and self-sufficient, but it is because they had to be. So it is not one of those nurturing learning processes that we talked about, running for student government and learning how to run and fail and put posters up the next time, right? This is not a nurturing, slow roll. This is a hardcore, you're 8 years old and you're making your mac and cheese because I'm not home for dinner. Okay. That provides that type of learning. You're learning, you're doing, right? You're functioning.
No, I think it was Dad. I think it was Dad.
But it's stressful, right? Learning when you're thrown in the fire, like it's just stressful. And when you're in that space of stress, you might be able to do a whole lot of things, but it certainly is not building your self-esteem, right? You're not learning from doing and failing and tripping and loving and iterating, right? That's self-esteem building. This is just stress and necessity. Okay. So again, they might look very functional, but they lack that inside space of, I did this, right? I'm really proud of myself. And they might have that feeling, because I've heard this a lot of times, that they feel proud that they did it on their own, despite. I did this. I came out of high school and I graduated and I did this without them at all. Right? So there is space and opportunity for some of that pride, but that feeling is not a particularly healthy transference to an adult and in their own relationships, right? It makes people very guarded. It makes it very hard to connect and open up and feel vulnerable. They're not used to it, right? They're not used to people seeing them fail and still love them unconditionally. They are just used to being quite perfect, right? And if they're not and they misstep, they have no idea what's going to happen because they haven't had anyone to show them. So these cons, kids have trouble controlling their emotions, again, because there's not that modeling. They don't have very many coping strategies. Again, these are the kids that were often in my office because maybe they were cutting, maybe they were using, maybe they have cries, right? But they don't exactly know how to ask for help. There's some academic challenges. And again, they're difficulty maintaining and nurturing social relationships. They're not used to being able to connect with somebody. They just have to be, right? And they have to do it themselves. Cole, anything you want to chime in before I kind of shift gears a little bit?
I would just chime in as a
Definitely.
whole. what you said towards the end, obviously, you hit it right on the top of the nail. But when you were talking more of the authoritative parenting style, I just think as as a kid, in a kid's perspective, having that open line of communication with your parent is just more important than anything else. Even coming from a family who's not the best at it, as I go into my older years of as I go into my older years of adolescency, you can kind of see it emerge more. And I just think being able to establish that early, especially at a young age, if you can, and even if you can't, being able to work really hard with your teens as soon as possible in order to keep that line of communication open and being able to share with each other, you know, your expectations that you work together to build and the goals you set for each other. And just having that connection, I think is so important. Yeah.
Good. And it's something that can start super early, and it's something that can get introduced. You can be doing it a different way for 16 years and you can start tomorrow. Um, so it's a really important piece, that communication. Thank you for echoing that. Modeling. So let's say that we're all on board and we're all doing authoritative parenting and we're all lovely and connecting and talking and all that good stuff. If what you do is very different from what you say, it can be confusing. Okay, so I'm going to say that again. If what you do is very different from what you say, it can be confusing for your kids. So if you are using, right, very regularly because you are stressed and you identify that, right? You come home and like, oh my gosh, it was such a hard day. I need to pour I'm going to have a glass of wine. I just need, again, these are not extravagant, giant, like gaping, obvious, oh my gosh, I would never do that, right? These are quite normal things, right? So that is saying to your teenager in the kitchen, this is what one does when they are stressed, right? My mom is a totally normal person. She doesn't have a substance abuse problem that I know of. There isn't any flags here, but you are articulating to somebody in an impressionable age who is trying to figure out their values and their experience with using, that when you are stressed, this is something you do to become less stressed. And so when that kid is, coming out of their final exams and going to a party and probably is feeling very stressed, maybe about the exams, maybe about the people who were at the party, maybe about what they're wearing, maybe about, some drama that went on. There are a gazillion reasons why a teenager can be stressed, right? What they have at their immediate disposal is, oh, maybe I should have a drink because that's what my mom does. Right. And again, this isn't like some giant, you know, that drug commercial about, I learned it from you, dad. Like, this isn't some horrible thing, but it is something to consider, right? Are you using, when you're stressed, are you using, let's celebrate, let's go open a bottle of champagne? Again, not giant bad, right? But those messages get infused, right? Are you using alone a lot, right? Like, just leave me alone. I'm just having a drink. I just want to be by myself, right? That is sending messages very clearly, right? That these are appropriate times to use. And this isn't about anything about brain development or why alcohol is bad for your brain or why weed is bad for your brain, any of that stuff, right? Because the kids are not always going to be absorbing that information. They hear it a gazillion times. It's just not always the most scintillating bit for them. And it often doesn't necessarily change the needle, because of what you're doing is different than what you're saying. What you do will trump, right? So you can say till the cows come home, you're not supposed to, don't do this and don't do this and don't do this. Well, that's exactly what you do every single time. So I don't understand why not, right? It's just hard. And it also comes, even if you're Lisa Damore uses this term of a cold brain and a hot brain. So a cold brain being like your very steady, rational brain, right? So even if a kid's cold brain is saying, no, I am not going to use, I have no interest in using, I'm going to this party because I want to see with my friends, but I don't want to do it. And they get to their red zone and they get to a party and their red zone of their brain gets activated because they're a little bit more nervous. They're not comfortable. They might be around, people who are doing something different. They might be anxious. They might be uncomfortable. And then that rational thinking part of their brain, it's not that they were being dishonest, right? They had every intention of not using, but now they default to what is the most available information that I have. The most available information people have is what you do, right? You're mimicking, you're aping, right? So what am I going to do? I'm nervous, I'm stressed. I am going to say yes to that drink because that's what I see someone at home doing really almost every night, right? Regardless of all the conversations. So that modeling is really, really important. Okay. And it doesn't mean that you don't use, it means that you are giving them other ways of accomplishing these goals, right? So you come home and you name your stress. I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to call Sally, right? I am going to just sit in a dark room by myself. Can you just give me 10 minutes? Right? I am so stressed. I need to decompress. I'm going to put this music on so loud. You might want to put on headphones. Or I'm going to go snuggle with our dog. Like whatever it is, you are giving them options that they can emulate, right? Totally legal. Same thing with celebrating, right? Let's go to our favorite restaurant, or let's go paint a picture, or let's go to the beach, or let's go, all of these different things that shift, let's go for a hike, to spend the day together. Like it's just, there's so many opportunities, especially out here, to celebrate these things, right? Or to kind of reflect on those moments in a different way than drinking. Also to consider how you talk about use. Okay, there's a lot of, I notice this all the time as my friends are getting older and older, and there are these stories of these seemingly kind of glory days in high school where people are really messed up, right? They're really like, oh my gosh, do you remember that? Like, I don't even remember how we got home. Like, does anybody remember how we got home? Like, that was a crazy night, right? And it's this like very light, story that your kid will hear, right? And it kind of makes it feel like, well, that was fun. My parent is still talking about it. It was something that was obviously normal. They turned out okay, right? There's a whole lot of things that they can take away from that, right? And you don't need to be saying, go out and do that, right? But when you say, do not go out and do that, they are certainly going to be thinking, well, you did, right? And it's really hard for them to be separating and teasing out the then and now, okay? So it's just it's a lot cleaner if those romanticizing stories are just not shared really with them so much, at least in that way, right? I think there can be a lot of benefits to talking about, to be honest and open and all that stuff about your use. There's lots of different points to that. But the romanticizing those glory days, I think is very risky. So then and now, thinking about your own assumptions, right? And what's normal, right? Either in the landscape today, in terms of, everyone's doing it. Thinking about, kids will be kids, but really thinking about alternatives, right? That there might be a lot of people doing it, but it's actually not everyone, right? It's not everyone. It's what people say about sex too, right? The research and the surveys about teens, and they think how many people are having sex, and they think it's like, 80% of their classmates are having sex. And you look at the survey and it's like, oh, interesting. It's like 14. That's a really big differential, right? But the people who are doing it are probably the ones talking about it. So it feels like it's everywhere, right? Or then there might be people not doing it who are still talking about it. So it feels like it's everywhere. But the data really is in our favor in terms of it is not everyone. It just might take a little bit more work to figure out what that alternative is, right? Going to the party and drinking or using is just kind of the easy out. We got to take a little bit more initiative, a little bit more creativity, and figure out something else to do with you, okay, with your friends. Um, Also spending, and this I think is the biggest piece, right? Because I think the parenting styles, people will get there and they'll get into their own, their own habits and their own way. But to be able to take the time as a parent or guardian to really think about what is acceptable to you. Okay. And thinking about it as compared to when you were a teen, because very frequently when push comes to shove and there's a consequence and it's big and people are getting upset, that it's very easy to go back into your body and be like, it's not that big of a deal. It's just not. I did the same thing when I was a kid. I'm not doing this. Like, this is fine, right? Like, I did so much worse actually when I was a kid, right? It's not worth all this. But today is different. It's different. There are legal ramifications that are incredibly significant that did not exist a generation ago and that are real and that are not just kind of, written and never observed, right? I mean, the Marin IJ is filled with them. So it's the same reason that you are, talking to your kids about what they're posting and what pictures they're sharing, and you don't want to be the kid who is whose face is plastered all around TikTok or next door or whatever, because they're the ones that did this thing, right? You don't want to be the parent who is creating a space and an environment that is unsafe for their kids' friends. It's just not worth it. So that might mean that you need to rethink a bit about what your norms are, right? What your level of comfort or tolerance is. So thinking about those consequences, having the conversation in advance, right, is incredibly important. It's everything, right? But you need to have the full buy-in from the adults, right? And I would recommend taking whatever time you need to get that consensus and to get that buy-in. That is more important than to kind of move fast and to have stricter limits. Because if you can't follow through with the consequence, it is worse than not having a consequence at all. So if you know that you're sitting there at the kitchen table after this talk and someone's saying like, I don't, I think zero. I think zero. I think they cannot use ever. And we're going to breathalyze them when they get home and from wherever they go. And, I think I do not want them to have any alcohol ever. And if they do, we are taking away the car for the rest of high school. Okay. First of all, that consequence would be so hard to follow through with, right? It is so hard for transportation to be impacted like that, right? Or they're not going to have a phone for the rest of high school, or they're going to lose their computer for a month, and their kids like, I can't do my homework, right? There are so many things like that it is much more impactful and important in terms of modeling how to keep your word, right? To take a step back and think of a consequence that you could actually withhold, right? And follow through with, even if it is not as giant, right? And it's the same thing about what the infraction is. If you know in your heart of hearts, honey, when push comes to shove, if they came home and they had a sip of something, I don't think I could do it. I mean, I'd want to talk to them about it. I'd want to talk about what they were, how they were feeling or what they were thinking, but like, I don't think I can follow through with that, right? You need to have the patience and the trust to be able to have that conversation and land in a place where everyone in that home agrees. Okay. Because otherwise it's going to get undermining and splitting. And the importance of keeping your word is everything. That means if it's the same if there is a punishment as if there was a prize, right? The kid who said you were going to get me ice cream after school and you're like, oops, right? It's the same feeling of the importance of doing what you say you're going to do, right? You said that if I did this and I came in late, I would be grounded next weekend, but I'm not grounded next weekend. I'm clearly not bringing this up, but I now know that they're not going to follow through with this. I now know that I can't actually trust them, right? That this is too much for them. They're not going to actually follow through. And it might be that you were just trying to be nice, or you were trying, you were proud of that, it was a hard week and you didn't, so tell them, right? Be open about it, be honest about it, have connection in another way. But if you don't keep your word, it erodes trust. So this advanced conversation, right, which is all about that, that joining and the negotiating between the teen and the parent. You need the time and the place that is right, right? You can't. It's not just kind of arbitrary and quick. And to really spend time focusing on your kid and not their friends, or not what their friends are doing, or not what you think their friends are doing. That is a really hot no. They get very defensive, for good reason. I mean, their friends are incredibly important to them. So you can just keep focused on the kid in front of you. And it might be that those peers or those friends come up because they're thinking about things that might get in their way of being successful. That's fine, but you're not the one bringing it up. Okay. So the troubleshooting, right? So let's say that they did it. Let's say that they broke it, that there's a consequence going on. With this model, you are able to say, right, when you did that, was there a part of you that thought it might be a bad idea? Right? And your kid will probably say, yeah. Pretty often, they know when something's a bad idea. And then a parent can say, what stopped you from listening to yourself? Right? Again, you're building that skill of self reflection, right? And you are identifying what got in their way, right? I was listening to myself, but then I was just so nervous. I was so nervous, I didn't know what else to do. Right. And they just handed me it and I didn't, it's like, okay, should we practice? Do you want to practice how to say no? Do you want to practice having something else in your cup if that feels more comfortable? Do you so you're able to troubleshoot, right? Because they're not just looking to get out of something, they're actually being able to reflect about what went wrong. Because again, in that cold mind, in their cold brain, they had agreed. They didn't think they were going to do this. And they did. Right. And it might have surprised them even. And what is so frequently spoken instead is that question, like, what were you thinking? Right. And that's not some categorically horrible thing question to ask. And it happens all the time because parents are frustrated. But for a kid, they weren't thinking. They likely were not thinking. That is why they are in this predicament. Right. And now they're definitely not thinking because they're scared and I can't learn anything from when I'm scared. So there is no learning. Right? There is no self-reflection. They're just in this defensive space of, I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I don't know, I'm sorry. What do you mean you don't know? How could you not know? How could you not know what you were thinking? That's even worse. And the kid's like, oh my God, just make this stop. Just make it stop. I don't know what I was thinking. No one likes to not have an answer. It never feels very good. Right? But very frequently when there is a miss like that, a teenager does not know. Right? Something else went on in their brain and led them down a different path than what they expected. It happens, right? So that compassion, that learning, that real discipline that comes from that self-reflection and the probing, it's like a reflective essay, right? Those aren't, generally very fun, but they make you think, right? This conversation would make you think as opposed to just kind of cowering and shame and sorry. And the most important thing, I think, to avoid is the consequence of connection. And this is something I'd noticed, I very intentionally, I didn't have it originally, but I took it out of my old presentation and included it tonight because I just feel like there is nothing more important than this. So the punishment is not removal of your attention. Okay? A consequence should be sufficient to instill the learning, right? Just the consequence. Right? That if then, very rarely should it ever say, then I am not going to love you, right? That I am not going to talk to you, that I am going to make you fend for yourself if you do this, right? That would sound very odd, but that is very frequently what parents do, right? I can't deal with you, right? And that is shame, right? That prohibits any learning for a kid. Shame and regret are these dirty, toxic things that are very, very hard to repair. Mistakes, people can move through. Okay? So the consequence should be sufficient. And if it's not, again, if you were thinking like, oh my gosh, I know I'm supposed to be patient, but it's been a really long patienting, then we need to think about a different consequence. Okay, so it needs to be something that is maybe more relevant to them. Maybe you're saying you can't use your phone, and the kid's like, great, fine, I don't need my phone, I have my iPad, right? So it's not going to work, or whatever it is, right? You can't go out Friday night. It's fine. I'm working anyway on Friday night. I don't need to go out. So really honing in on what that consequence is where your attention should be, not getting madder and madder and eroding connection. If there's a consequence that results in a teen missing something social, right? The ability to say, I know you're disappointed you cannot go to that party. We canceled our plans. We're here if you want to make that new recipe you found. Okay. I know we're not your first pick. I'd love to take you to that movie that you've been talking about. Okay. They're not going to say yes. I mean, more than likely, right? They're not going to take you up on it, but it makes it very hard for them to misinterpret your teaching, right, as anger and not unconditional love, right? It makes it very hard for them to say, I messed up and now they do not love me. I am unlovable, right? And you are watching their self-worth just erode.
I think we may have lost Annie. And so maybe while we're waiting for Annie to come back, fingers crossed, Cole, I might just pass it to you and see if you have anything that you want to share. I have a couple questions that I can pass your way, unless you have some ideas of things that you just wanted to share based on what Annie was sharing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Annie really hit it spot on with everything she said. But I will say, as a teenager and as a son, um, when she's talking about like quote unquote everyone does it, I think really as a teenager, that's the biggest persuader. So if you're talking about usage, um, and it kind of ties into leading by example, and you see your parents doing it, and you see everyone doing it around you, it really kind of leads you down that path. And so being able to have that open conversation and kind of set boundaries and just knowing that there are other opportunities, I think is just one of the most important conversations you can have, especially as your teenager continues to grow and starts, getting into that part of their life. But then, of course, Molly, if you have any other questions, I'd love to answer some.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your input, Cole, and we're hoping that Annie can join us. I think she had maybe a couple slides to wrap up, but I guess, Cole, I did have a specific question for you of just based on maybe your experience. We don't have to put, your parents on blast here, but maybe with your experience or your friends' parents, like what are some of the most helpful things that either your parents or your friends' parents do to build, that healthy kind of communication pathway? And facilitate like a trusting relationship.
Yeah. Um, Me personally, I love to do this through like games. So it's just kind of the first example that comes to mind. But throughout my entire childhood, and especially going into like my teen years and adulthood, um, being able to communicate, having like a sit down conversation one on one, it's kind of uncomfortable, like as a teen. But being able to like freely talk about it while maybe playing like a game. So what me and my mom often do, like, we're playing cards every night, and we're able to talk about whatever she wants to talk about. Any difficult topics are often brought up while we're playing cards, and I just think it offers like a different pathway or like something else that I can enjoy doing with her while also maintaining like a serious conversation and being able to talk about that much more freely.
Thank you so much, Cole. I love that. Sounds awesome. I love the idea of playing games and having conversations. And it looks like we got Annie back. And so
Yes,
Annie,
I don't
we're
know
happy to have you back.
I'm so sorry. I just
No, we're
went
happy
dark.
to
I don't
have
know
you.
why. I'm on my phone. My computer is on though, so I just have one more slide. If I just can read it, does that make sense? I don't know if I'm still
Sure.
sharing. Okay.
We love that.
Okay. So they won't let us lead them. They don't feel us loving them. So let them feel you loving them, not only when they are perfect, convenient, joyful, easy, but especially when they aren't. Especially when they are angry, unfair, unkind, messy, enraged, disengaged, brittle, hurtful, especially then. Because this is what it truly means to love them unconditionally. This is what it means when we say to them, you can come to me for anything. You can tell me anything. This is their anything. And they are asking, will you still love me even now? So that is a quote from Karen Young, who does an incredible work around anxiety mostly, but she has a website called Hey Sigmund, that I always like to find nuggets in. So thank you, and I apologize for that gap, and I am ready to listen.
Thank you so much, Annie. We're so happy you were able to jump back in.
Yeah.
It would not be, I think every time we've had a Let's Talk discussion, there's been some type of tech glitch that keeps us on our toes. So it keeps it exciting. But I really want to thank both Annie and Cole for their time. I just have to mention, Cole, we have a lot of comments in the chat about like just how wonderful of a suggestion that was, to be using games as a kind of a platform to be connecting with a teen. We got some, a couple questions that I'd love to, throw out for both you, Cole and Annie. Annie, you gave such incredible suggestions. Cole, you gave, like incredible insight. And I guess one question would be like, what is one thing that maybe we all can do, we can all walk away with tonight, we can implement to strengthen our relationships and feel, more effective as parents, and for our teens to feel more connected and heard?
I can go first. Uh, I've mentioned it before, but I think really the main thing is just, especially as you start to, you know, create stronger relationships, and if your child's going from middle school to high school, obviously there becomes sort of a more of a like equal component parts, and you start to be less, um, I would say it's just more respect between the two. And so I think being able to have a conversation about that particularly, and being able to provide them with insight into your life and what you feel is most responsible for them to do, and what they should be doing, and just your point of view and where you're coming from, I think is the most important thing. Because often as kids, our parents will tell us what we should do and what we should not without explaining themselves. And I think providing that explanation is just one of the most important things you can do.
Oh, Annie, you're muted. We'd love to hear your response, but you are muted.
Mess. One of the things, kind of like Cole's idea about the game, right, is to find something that you can do with your kid, not just in terms of having these hard conversations, but just in general, because I think that starts to become harder and harder, or it can, I guess, get harder and harder as they get older. And you lose that kind of unloaded time, right, where you're just kind of sharing space, and frequently the interests start to actually like really be very different. It's not just like I don't like the same things anymore, it's like I actively don't like what you're doing. And I know that this is not a talk designed around that, but that idea of like, when kids are like, my parents don't like me, like I think they might love me, but they don't like me. Like there's no delight in me. They don't like the music I listen to. They don't like the video. They don't like how I spend my time. They don't like my friends. They don't like what I look like. They don't like what I do with my hair. They don't like my clothes. Like that's kind of a hard, it's a hard way to feel connected when you feel like the person that you love so much and says that they love you don't really feel like they like you. And I think that it is important to offer, again, that inconvenience, right? Of like, you know what? We're going to take turns. On the way to school, we're going to listen to your music. On the way home from school, we're going to listen to mine, right? Like, just get a little bit into what they like and learn about it, right? If they're playing a ton of times playing video games, learn about it. Learn about what they like about it, learn about what they, who they talk to, who plays this one. Can you win this one, or is this like gathering materials, or do you like win coins? Like, you can be totally ignorant to it, and they get to, be able to educate you and feel connected. So that idea of my parent cares enough to ask me these questions, to do things beyond their natural willingness, right? They might not want to go see that movie, but they're going to go see it with me anyway because they love me. I think builds up both connection, but also those opportunities for some of those, those conversations to even happen organically.
Thank you so much. And I had one more question. This one was for Cole. Um, I'm going to actually broaden the question a tiny bit just because I'm curious. Of Cole, maybe for you, for your friends, not to put you directly on the spot unless you want to be, but what are some of the things that contributes to your decisions around not using substances or alcohol, or just making decisions that are for your health and for your future?
Personally, for me, I think education was the biggest thing around it. So actually in 8th grade, we were given a small presentation on the effects of usage on your brain, and it just interested me so much. And obviously, um, usage can mean a lot of different things for different people, and really what's most important is being able to use it safely. So obviously, I think as parents, it's extremely scary, especially in Marin County, with fentanyl on the rise, that it's so easy for one kid to just make one mistake at a party, and then they're put in so much danger that they could die so quickly. So I think really the biggest thing as parents is to encourage safe use and be able to check what you're using, um, and really be cautious about it. But for me personally, my mom's always kind of been my role model growing up. She's been very wary of substance use and always encouraged me thoughtfully not to use it. But then as I progressed into high school and saw peers experimenting, it was really the education aspect that led to me making my own choices about it and learning what it does to your brain and to other people.
Thank you so much, Cole. Um, any last thoughts before we start wrapping up? You gave us so many interesting things to think about tonight, and just wanted to give you an opportunity to share anything else that you might have in mind.
Yeah. Um, I think kind of like my including that slide again, I think it is important to keep having the conversations, like over and over and over, right? Or whatever it is that your mantra is, to help keep your kid connected to both you, your values, and to themselves, right? That idea of like, whether it's like, you know, you're you're worth um you are worth saying no, right? You are worth standing out. You are worth um calling me at any hour, right? Like whatever it is, these little nuggets, right, that can just plant a seed for a kid and have them access it really readily when they most need it. Because when you are the most stressed and most need help, right, you are going to go to the lowest hanging fruit. And if your wisdom is only said once during one conversation 3 years ago, right, it is going to be very hard for that kid to pluck it, right? Like, oh, I think my mom said something to me awkward in the car one day after some parent ed talk and something about something. I don't know. It was like 3 years ago. And maybe I'm not supposed to do this. I don't really know. Like, that's not an easy grab, right? But if every, few days or few weeks or moments, or you're using social, social things like things on the news, right? That those are very easy ones to talk about, right? When you hear something on the news about someone who overdosed, or you hear about someone's cousin, or something that's not personal, and you can talk about it with your kid, right? And just reinforce, 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 right? Like this scared me my socks off, right? I have to like I am really scared about this. Like what do you know about it? Right? Tell me. Like what do what do you and your friends think about this? What are your like that you're just having these conversations all the time because it is everywhere, right? So I often talk about I do a lot of talks I feel like about college stuff, and with those people, I'm always like, they hear this all the time. all the time. They're inundated with it. They do not need to come home to this conversation, right? It is wildly opposite with this, right? That if it is so everywhere, whether it's sex or drugs or alcohol, any of those things, they're so surrounded by it that if you as parents are not talking to them about it, you're the only ones, right? They're hearing messages from everybody else. And if you want your values and your message and your safety concerns to be heard, you need to get into the conversation. And it doesn't always need to be about discipline, and it doesn't always need to be, you don't always have to have the answer, really. It really can just be as clear and clean as what do you think about that? Like, that's it, right? And then all of the other kind of hard legwork and the consequences and the follow, all of those things will come, but you need to have that conversation, and you need to be, again, inconvenienced enough to have it kind of on repeat, because you never know when that party is where they're going to be tempted, or when they're going to feel uncomfortable and want to do something to change it, right? And their normal strategies aren't working. You want to be the voice in their mind.
Thank you so much, Annie, for all of your insights, and thank you, Cole, for all of your insights as well. I want to thank everyone who attended tonight. I think this was a really incredible discussion. I think it's so interesting, especially since a lot of us have been in both roles. We've been both the teenager and the parent.
Yeah.
And so we were just so happy to have everyone. Please make sure to fill out the post-event survey. We'd love to hear your feedback. This tailors what we do in the future. And then also 2 lucky random attendees will be selected as winners and will receive $25 DoorDash gift cards. But thank you all so much for attending. Please make sure to fill out that survey. And thank you so much for being here. We'll see you at our next discussion.
I'm so sorry about the tech issue. I still don't even know what happened, but I'm
It
glad
wouldn't be
you were
Zoom
still
without
here.
a tech
Thank
glitch.
you.
So we're so happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cole.